Hello and welcome to the kickoff episode of Season 8 of Five Alarm Task Force. If you're listening to the audio, well, you've already heard the introduction. If you're listening to the video, it's great to have you back. It's great to be back with you. Hard to believe that we're in Season 8 already, that we started way back in 2016 as wee little kids in those days. Today, and in this season, one of the things we're going to be doing, and those of you who follow us on a regular basis know that the Firefighter Cancer Initiative and the Firefighter Behavioral Health Initiative are very, very important to us. We've done multiple shows on them, and we're doing more this season because it is that necessary. We are seeing right now, excuse me, in a posting I saw yesterday, that as of, I believe it was the 31st of July, we have lost 44 firefighters in this calendar year, which puts us on a bad curve towards either meeting or, heaven forbid, beating last year's numbers, which were the highest, I believe, since 2008. So today, we're privileged to have a guest we kind of just accidentally met on, I think, on social media. And when she told me about her experience in the book that she wrote, I just knew that we had to have her as a guest. And my guest today is Dr. Mynda Ohs. She currently has a private practice in Nevada where she specializes in first responders and their families. Additionally, she holds contracts with several agencies nationwide to respond on scene to critical incidents to provide crisis support. And as a matter of fact, yes, this podcast interview was supposed to be done yesterday, Tuesday, but because of one of those emergencies, we had to postpone it so that Dr. Ohs could attend to that and then come back and join us for this episode. Critical incidents that she has participated in as a first responder include the San Bernardino terrorist attack, the 1st of October shooting, the Montecito mudslides, and numerous line of duty deaths for the Forest Service and CAL FIRE. And we would be remiss if we didn't remember our three brothers that were lost Sunday evening in the crash of the helicopters fighting the fire in Riverside. So may their memories always be for a blessing. She recently joined Las Vegas Metro Police Crisis Negotiation Team as a consultant. She is a subject matter expert on several committees, helping to develop and implement curriculum and policies that will improve the mental health for all first responders and their families. As a former first responder herself and married 26 years to a now retired battalion chief, she is passionate and committed to educating and improving the beliefs about getting help. Dr. Ohs, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the show and a pleasure to meet you as well.
Yes, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. And yes, thanks for being understanding about me needing to move my schedule from yesterday.
Yeah, I kind of guessed what it was when you notified me on Monday. Was not surprised, and in a way was happy to know that somebody of your caliber was going to be helping our brothers and sisters.
Yes.
So let's talk about what you used to do. Now, you said your husband's is a retired battalion chief. So, and we know, and we have viewers and listeners who know they live in two first responder families. In other words, both people are there. They're first responders. They may not both be in the fire service. They may be one police, one fire, one EMS, whatever that matters. But we've had a couple of folks on where they've talked about this. And sometimes one of them mentioned that they were having a little bit of, I guess, a disagreement. And they finally looked at each other and said, what are we arguing about? We're dealing with the same pressure, just a different label on it, but it's the same pressure. Yeah. And that was their first forward step.
Yeah. And, well, you got double trouble when you're got two first responders because you got both dealing with burnout and trauma and hypervigilance. And so it definitely is harder. I have quite a few clients that are double also.
Yeah. So that's going to be a challenge as well. And again, on the other side of the coin, to give, for example, my wife, and we're coming on 49 years in October, who had no background, had no interest in fire and emergency services. But when I approached her, I didn't plan on doing it. I just happened to see the fire station and walked in. And next thing I knew, I walked out with an application in my hand. But when we spoke about it, there were times that, she was very concerned. Unfortunately, for me, it was great to be in North Carolina, but the dispatchers had kind of a twang in their voice. And so we'd have the plectron go off in those days because we didn't have pagers yet. And I'd come back and I said, "Did you listen to the call?" I said, "Well, I heard people talking, but I couldn't understand what they were saying with that. Wake about do this and I'm going to do that, station 75. I said, "Okay, honey, I'll tell you about it when I get home."
Yeah.
And so even those of us without partners who are first responders, our lives take a toll on them as well, and our kids and our parents and whoever we live with, or people, even our friends who aren't in emergency services get concerned about us. So what was your background? What branch were you in? When did you see that your focus narrowing to those pinpoint where you weren't seeing everything you needed to see anymore?
Well, I am an old person. So I worked in the ambulance back in the 90s, actually. So I got hired. Yeah. But yeah, I'll be 54 this year. But yeah, I did the ambulance for 5 years in California. It was a private ambulance. That's when they were still a little mom and pop owned. They weren't these big conglomerates that they are now. And I loved it. I worked in EMS, and then I also worked as an ER tech part-time. So yeah, I had 3 jobs at the time. And I absolutely loved it. Met my husband on the job. He was a paramedic for CAL FIRE. And it's a cliche, right? The EMT and the firefighter, or the dispatcher, or the ER nurse, because you spend all the time together. So
exactly,
of course you're going to meet people in this industry because it's like-minded, same love for the adrenaline and the excitement, same kind of personalities. My first language is actually sarcasm. So, it works really well when somebody understands that and doesn't take offense to it. So yeah. So we've been together this year, will be 28 years and 26 years married. And so I loved it and I had a blast with it. And the only reason I got out, kind of like you, I didn't get injured, but I got really sick. I caught meningitis.
Oh, wow.
From a patient. And it nearly killed me. I spent a lot of time in the hospital. It took me a year to recover. And I just couldn't go back and do the 24-hour shifts anymore. I just didn't have the stamina to do it. And I had a lot of memory loss, so I couldn't remember how to get to the hospitals.
Wow.
So I had to get out of it. And then we decided to have kids. And I stayed home and then decided, what do I want to go into? And I went into psychology and started going to school. And just when I graduated, I wanted to get back into somehow the first responder community. And, I started doing counseling for them and the emergency responses, and absolutely fell in love, found my spot, because I really felt like I was paying it forward also, like you were doing. Because so many of our men and women sacrifice so much without question. And my goal was to get them to retirement with as few mental health issues as possible, to enjoy that retirement.
Right.
So that's what kind of led me down the path. And, I wrote my first book on being in a relationship with first responders, just because, wow, even though I was a first responder, there were so many parts of that I wasn't prepared for, that nobody was telling anybody about the different stressors that come into your home that are very different than regular couples. And the issues that my husband and I struggled with. And then the second book, which we talked about, was my book on retiring as a first responder, because, wow, that's another, huge step, is to have to give up that passion, that job that you fought for, that you love. And, it becomes an identity.
Right. It does. And as I mentioned before we went on, when I got hurt and I was transferred to being an inspector, which was interesting too. I can't say that it wasn't, and running the video unit for them. So I would get on calls, but I'd be shooting video rather than the other. But I think you brought up a very good point, and that is that we really are unique, folks. It's one thing people say, well, you go in for the lights and the sirens, and maybe you do that at the beginning, and you get all, as we used to say in North Carolina, eat up with it.
Yeah.
And I remember when I first started in this volunteer outfit, I had a 4-beam sealed beam light on my roof. I had a Kojak red light in my dash. I had lollipops on my back deck. And within about 2 years, I just went back to my little Kojak light, and that was all I needed. But I think that when we are in some sort of a close relationship, whether it's we're still living with family, or we're dating, or we're in a relationship already, one of the things that we tend not to do is be 100% honest with our significant other about what we do, what we see. Now, there are good reasons why in some cases, because listen, we all agree, no matter which branch we serve, there's crap that we just don't want anybody else to see, that we see. That's it. Right. That's, what I read as part of your bio. You certainly have seen it. You really can't be in more than a couple of years today without seeing that. And
it's a different call volume than when you and I did it, right? You were before me and even my husband. But one of the things I teach, if I could add to what you're saying before I forget, because my memory will go off.
Welcome to my world at my age.
Something shiny, and I'll forget what I was going to say. But when you said that, see, I already lost my train of thought about being unique and the stressors and stuff about the relationships. In my book, I talk about what people don't understand, and this is what caught me, is work brain and home brain. And so, work brain, I have to explain this to a lot of first responders because it's like they know it, but they don't know it in like how to articulate it. So work brain is way up here, right? It's adrenaline filled, it's operational, it's task oriented, and there are no emotions involved in it. And that's up here. Home brain, you have to come crashing down on home brain. And what a lot of our first responders don't realize is it takes 18 hours for your body to physiologically come out of work brain to home brain. So when our first responders walk through the door, they're in work brain. That means they're going to interact, they're going to deal with problems, they're going to address their spouses and family members from a work brain mentality, which is, again, task-driven, operational, and problem solvers, and no emotions. And, that really gets in the way with those relationships when you're, dealing with those, when you're dealing with your family in that mindset.
Oh, absolutely. I was lucky those first 4 years that I was in, we had no children yet. So it was just my wife and I. We had a nice little apartment. I worked. But again, one of the things I want to add to what you just said is when you're a volunteer or paid on call,
right,
is the fact that you have your regular job that you're earning your basic salary with. Then you're a volunteer, and then you're you're a parent or a spouse. So now you have 3 brains that you have to work with, because you have to be able to do your real work. That's your profession. Then you have to be able to, the siren goes off, I got to run, chief, boss, I'll be back as soon as I can. So then you're in that mode. And then finally you come back to work and you go home. And now you're 2 brains exhausted to 1, and it sucks.
Yeah. Well, and then you have nothing left to give to the family. And that's in lie where the biggest problem happens for a lot of families. And I know I experienced it, is if you don't understand it, then you feel second best always. You feel put on the back burner. And, and if you're a volunteer or, paid call and you have another job, now you're not second, you're maybe third, right? Or fourth. At least it feels that way. And another, issue that you mentioned is, you don't want to burden your spouses with what you see. But what I tell a lot of my first responders is you don't have to tell them all the gore and the guts and all that stuff. Because if you are not communicating with your significant others or family about what you're doing 28, 48, 96 hours worth of your time, you're really leaving them out of a big part of who you are. And so being able to share with them your passion and saying, man, I ran this awful pediatric call today. That's all you have to say. You don't have to say what it was and traumatize your loved ones, but you have to include them in that part of your life. And that's why as couples, we can grow apart in the first responder community quicker than the average couple, because we already have that distance because of the time away. And now you're not sharing what you did on that time away. So that bigger gap of being connected and the intimacy and knowing each other. So it is really important. A lot of guys used to tell me, oh, I don't take my job home. Yes, you do. You just don't talk about it. It's up there. It's rattling around up there.
Yeah.
You just aren't verbalizing it.
Yeah.
And then your spouse is like, what's wrong? And you're like, nothing.
Nothing.
I'm
okay.
I'm okay. But we're like, we can see, like, you all look off. No, I'm not. I'm fine. But there's stuff going on. And then your spouse is like, well, is it me? Do you just not want to share with me? Do you not trust me? Do you not feel comfortable with me? And then it becomes a personal thing versus the job coming into the home.
Very true. As a friend of mine said, sometimes as much as we have to be careful of a BLEVE, a boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion on a call, we have to worry about that same thing at home. Because when we stop communicating with our significant others, that puts the pot on the stove and the fire's lit. And it can only take so much of that heat before something's going to happen that's negative. And
100%.
if we try to keep it all bottled in all the time, and as somebody also said, I think it was maybe in one of the trades, that just the fact that you talk about with your colleagues is not the cure, because we always talk about the calls with our colleagues.
Yeah.
The kid I met, he was 18 years old when we got voted in the same meeting, same department back there in 1977. And he was an 18-year-old kid. I was 25 already, and he was still a kid. I was already married a couple of years and had my first full-time professional job down there. And I had a blast getting to know him, and he's still 40 plus years later, my best friend today, other than my wife. He's still my best friend. But I had to kind of steer him as well. So now I was taking care of myself, taking care of my wife, trying to help this young man who we kind of connected together, and still do my job. And I was working 60 to 70 hours a week, 7 days. So, and being a volunteer firefighter at the same time. So as I said, I didn't want to burden my wife with, and maybe you brought up a good point. I should have been more open about what I was doing without putting in all the graphic details.
Yeah. And that's all you have to do is, because here's the thing. Most women that can make it for all these years, or men, because there's women firefighters, right? Spouses, significant others, we have to be strong. So we have to, be independent. We have to be strong, because, being married to a first responder is not for the faint at heart. It takes a lot. And so, any spouse wants to be able to be there for their, significant other. And when our first responders try to protect us or shield us or be our rocks all the time, it doesn't give us the opportunity to return the favor. And so we want to be able to be there and support you guys, and, in any way we can. And so it's about figuring out in your relationship, because every relationship is different, right? So especially for our double first responders, you can handle a lot more of the details than maybe somebody who's not in it. So for me, my husband could talk to me and tell me, all the calls and all the stuff, and it didn't bother me because, I did it. But it didn't mean he did, because he still slipped into that protecting and not wanting to burden. And, I was taking care of 2 kids and going to school. He didn't want to burden. But I always knew something was up, but he just wouldn't share. And that's really what got in part of the way of our marriage for a spell, is that we just stopped talking. we just start going through the motions. And
Right.
a lot of our first responders come home and like you said, talking about burnout, right? So you got burnout, you got compassion fatigue, and you've got PTSD. If you have any one of those, that's going to compound the issues at home because you're numb and you feel nothing. And so that's how you deal with everything, is just numb. And many of our significant others will say, yeah, they're home and they're there physically, but they're not mentally present. And I hear that complaint all the time because they're just they're on autopilot.
Yeah, and that complaint's been around a long time too. Because
Yeah.
even back in my day, it was the same thing. And back in my day, we didn't have any women yet.
Right.
Not that I agreed with that, because I've been a proponent of equality in everything for years and years. But I think that a lot of men try to still keep the concept of chivalry alive.
Yes.
To protect it, not out of any detrimental feelings about their spouse. It's because I'm the breadwinner, so to speak. I got the tough job, and I don't need to expose her to that. She's got enough she has to worry about without me burdening her with, or him with, that. And I think that we have to understand that if we're in a relationship, it's not just based on that first date that we had that set off the fireworks. It's who we are in growing with each other and living with each other and being there for each other in the good times and the bad times. We don't need to quote the vows, but I mean, that's the agreement. When we be a couple, whether we're married or just we're a couple, we want to take care of each other. And so sometimes we overdo that.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, with our first responders, there's another layer than maybe the average citizen, because you're out there seeing the worst that can happen to families and loved ones. You run on a call where somebody's spouse got killed, or in a car accident and died, or the child died. And so then you go home and you become overprotective because you know how fragile life is. So then you overprotect children and your significant others, which it can look like you're being controlling, but it's just overprotection.
And I can tell you that I've been dealing with, for the last year, 2 years or so, with the whole thing about PFAS, is that knowing that Dr. Peasley found PFAS in gear, both new and used gear, dating back to 1977.
Yeah.
That meant that I was very lucky that department in North Carolina, our chief was very, very big with 3M in those days, because he was a specialist in flammable liquid fires. So we probably had about 130 5-gallon pails of AFFF in our storage area. But luckily, I never got any on me. The only couple of times it was used. I wasn't worried about that, but I was worried about my gear, because then I realized, as I learned more about it the last couple of years, is that when I moved upstate to New York, I had my bunker gear either in the back of my car, or I had it in the trunk, or during the winters, because it was so cold in Syracuse and we get a call, I'd have it right by the stairs, so I'd have it inside the house. I'm thinking this whole time, did I expose my wife and my daughters to the dangers of PFAS? But if it wasn't from my gear, it was from Teflon, because we were all buying Teflon pans when they came out on stick. And we didn't know there was anything such, PFAS. And even 10 years ago, when we started learning about BPA, and BPA was being forced to be removed from all our plastic stuff. And then all of a sudden, we okay, that's a breath. And then all of a sudden, no, we're back in the game again, because we found out that PFAS is in all our gear, and we could have been bringing that home. And of course, those of us who didn't wash our gear on a regular basis, because it was the sign of macho, having all the soot and stuff like that, we were just compounding the problem without even knowing that there was a problem at that time. So what was it, your illness that brought you to the realization? I mean, we talked about how I feel. And again, you wound up just leaving because you got sick, and I had to leave because of my injury, but it's not that I wanted to leave. And I think when you first got sick, you didn't want to leave either. It was You got it on the job, you caught the disease on the job, and you figured, okay, I'll get through this and I'll go right back to it.
Yeah.
But it took such a toll on you that opportunity just, you didn't feel it was still there for you.
Yeah.
So what did you start first thinking about when you started talking about, I loved what I was doing, but I don't think I can do this anymore. I just don't have the physical strength at this point.
Well, once the neurologist released me and said I could go back to work, I did try. I tried a couple shifts, and there was some spells where I got on the freeway and my partner would have to talk through the window to tell me how to get to the hospital, because I just couldn't remember how to get to a hospital that I went to thousands of times, right, over the last 5 years. And my fatigue, I just realized, like, I can't do it. And I was extremely sad because in the 90s, women coming on departments was just getting bigger, right? And there was a department that I worked with quite a bit, and I lived in the town, that came to me and kind of wanted to pick their own female, because, they were getting pressure to have females. So they wanted to pick their own female and came to me and they were like, we'll train you, we'll get you where you need to be to test. And, and I thought about it. I thought about doing that, going down that road and being a medic and stuff like that. And I just couldn't, I had lost so much weight and from being so sick, and I just couldn't, do it or stand the amount of time you work, right? The 24s, 48s and stuff. So that's when my husband and I had to talk about what are we going to do, And so I had just like maybe 6 months after I quit at the ambulance, I got pregnant with our son. So I was going to stay home anyways. So I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I thought maybe teaching, and, I had to totally reinvent myself because I had this path already paved out for myself, right? I had no other backup plan. And that's something I talk about in my retirement book. I did a survey monkey of 600 first responders, all kinds of first responders. And I asked them, how many of you have a backup plan? Because you are like professional athletes and you train like it, you work like it. And any day you show up, you could have a career-ending injury. What is your backup plan? And it was like 86% did not have a backup plan. They had never thought of what they would do if they got hurt. They just assumed that this was what they were going to do. Their 30 years, retire and live off their pension and live a good life. And that's why that was my goal, was that path, some variation of that path, whether it be firefighting, medic, that was still my path. So I had to reinvent myself, and it took a while. I was lost for a while. Now I was just a wife and a mom. And not that that's bad, but I had wanted more for myself. So my husband and I had to sit down and come up with a whole new plan. And because I didn't have an education and I couldn't go back to being a first responder, I had to go to school. So we just decided that I'd stay home with kids and he'd climb the career ladder, and do all the stuff he wanted with his career. And he had just changed departments. He had just left CAL FIRE and gone to Long Beach City. So, he wanted to kind of climb that ladder. So I was like, go for it. I'll take care of kids and go to school. And so I started, what's so crazy, I started my education on the teacher path. I was going to be a teacher. Then I realized this is not for me. I don't like this. I don't want to do it. So I switched to counseling. And that's what got me to where I am now. And just, working with first responders exclusively.
Well,
but it was hard.
We can hear, as you explain, the passion you have for what you're doing, and that it was the right choice. The fact is that all too often, as you said, we don't have backup plans. I remember my third year of the State Fire College when I had to do high-level rescue, and I had been agoraphobic since I was 5 years old, and we were going up a 6-story building on the campus where the program was being held that summer. And I said, what's going to happen if I can't do this class? I had done the first year, I did basic firemanship. Second year, I got hydraulics and pump operations, aced those. And I said, how am I going to do this? And the guy from our department, who is our mentor and went with me and my buddy, he said, look, He says, I've seen you go from you didn't know anything about fixing your own car or for the fire service, and now you can change your spark plugs, you can change your oil, you can do that, where every tool is on the two engines, where everything is on the tanker, everything is on the snorkel. He says, and on the rescue, he says, your stuff. Just, I'm telling you as your teacher, your stuff. And he said to me when we got to this exercise, first 2 days were classrooms, so that was fine. I had no problem with the classroom.
Yeah.
It was nice and low, sitting in a chair. But that third day, going up to the top, and the first thing they had me do was I was a victim, so I had to be bundled and dropped over. And in those days, we didn't even have the harnesses. The harnesses weren't available yet, so we used ropes. We had to tie the loops in the ropes and pull them underneath very tight. And but being the victim, and I knew I was supposed to trust these other firefighters, but when you're afraid of heights and you're sitting in this little wire basket and you're being put over the parapet 6 stories up, and you're agoraphobic, that's not easy.
No,
but I made it. And then after that one, the captain came to me and says, all right, you ready to be one of the rescuers this time? I said, come on. He goes, let's go up. And he encouraged me. I'm not going to say forced me, encouraged me. And I did it. And I felt so fulfilled that I overcame that childhood horror for me. And then as I was coming down, managing the basket, I'm thinking, wait a second, if I got this down, I got the rest of it down of who I am as a firefighter. And that moment was a turning point for me. Unfortunately, I didn't know that we'd be leaving the following summer, a year later, to move. But I never knew why I was sent to that program, and that was because, as I learned in 2017 when I was back in North Carolina, I got to visit the chief again. And he said to me, he goes, you ever wonder why I sent you and Richard to that fire college? And I said, yeah. He says, because you boys had leadership. You guys are going to be the captains in the volunteer squad. I said, well, why didn't you tell us? He says, because I didn't want you to know. I wanted you to be trained. I want to see what you were going to do with it. But I knew that what my decisions were going to be for the two of you. Yeah. So that gave me a little more confidence so that when we did move, and I had no idea there was going to be a volunteer company in the village we lived in outside of Syracuse. But when I saw the building there, and I said, I told my wife, I said, I think I'm going to. She goes, you're smiling. Why are you smiling? I said, I just saw the sign, DeWitt Volunteer Fire Department. She goes, oh, don't tell me you're starting again. I said, well, let me just go check it out and see what happened. And I did, and I went back and I did another 4 years there. It was a little different than North Carolina, but again, you give back and then you get cut off at the legs, like you and I both were. Yours was the illness, mine was the injury. But that doesn't mean we have to stop who we are.
Yeah.
I had always been a teacher anyway. That's what I started in. So I just decided I was going to find the best roads to be a teacher. I went into administration as well in my civilian line, and did okay. Always just yearning for that siren, that sound one more time, or being on that call one more time. I will say, and I've said this before, that when we said at the beginning of the show how we define ourselves, I still define myself today as a man of faith, a son, a father, a spouse, and a firefighter. I've since I got out, since I had to retire in '85, I've always carried a full BLS bag and extra tools, ropes, gloves in my car. I've stopped probably well over 200 times. My family tells me, as being first or second on scene. And even with my back injury that we've traced, even though it didn't happen in '92, we think it happened when I got hurt at the first fire college. I still do what I got to do. That's just who I am. And when I'm done and the adrenaline's isn't running anymore, I feel it. I pay the price. but even though I pay that price, I pay it with a smile because I know I helped somebody.
Yeah.
And
And
I'll
I
take
think it's
that.
like, if you think about the military, right? Like, have you ever heard like Marines?
Yeah,
You're not an ex-Marine, you're a former Marine, because once a Marine, always a Marine.
right,
It's the same with first responders, in that being a first responder is a calling. It's a service heart. It's not always about the adrenaline. It's
right.
about this calling to give back to your community or help people, make your community safer. And, it is, and the brotherhood and sisterhood, right? A lot of people love, once you get in, the camaraderie,
Absolutely.
the family, that mentorship, that leadership, like you just talked about, right? That leader that encouraged you to get up, go up the stairs, and to do this. That's something, that a lot of men and women love and look for. If they didn't get it in their home, sometimes they get it in the fire station or the police station, where they get that support, or they get that leader that they can look up to, that can mentor them, and maybe they didn't get that in their home. And so it provides, the fire department or police department can provide such healing for some people.
Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. We've seen it. We had a terrible injury to one of our firefighters back in those days. He was permanently disabled because of it. But for a while, he was still in his wheelchair work. He wouldn't take an electric chair, but he was still working as the mechanic. He'd get down on the creeper and crawl into the trucks and still what he could do. And we'd help him a little bit here and there. But, this is what he did for a while until they just, couldn't do it anymore because he just didn't have the muscle mass, to do it. But, the chief said to us, come on, we got to work together. He's still part of our family. And we're going to do everything we can. And that's what we did. And we did it whether it was somebody was sick with the flu or severe injury. I mean, that's just what we do. We help each other.
You get more help than you bargain for sometimes.
Yeah.
I always warn people, if they're off on injury, like, listen, you're going to get overwhelmed with all the phone calls and the texting, because they're your department, their families, they're going to want to help. And that's just one of the things that I am so grateful for, that when I talk to other spouses, I try to tell them, yes, there are some downsides to this, but there are so many upsides to being married to or a part of the first responder community. And, I remember one time when my kids were little, our son was in a car seat and I was picking up the oldest. She was like in first grade. And my husband was at work in Long Beach, which was like 75 miles away from where we lived, because he commuted. Yeah, he commuted. And we broke down, and it was a hot day, and he called, CAL FIRE was his old department that he worked for, but he called the station and said, hey, my wife and kids are broke down on the side of the road. It's hot. Can you go get them till AAA gets there? And they came and got me and took me to the station with the kids until AAA came. And, it's like, not regular people get that kind of
Right.
Care and support and love, where they say it doesn't matter what patch you have. We're all family.
Exactly.
When push comes to shove, people will show up from whatever agency to help another first responder family. And that's something that I cherish and love, that we have.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. That connection that we have with each other. I remember the first time I was able back in New York City for a conference, and the first day was okay. The second day wasn't going to do anything to help me do what I was doing in my civilian job. So I walked down the street, and I saw New York City Firehouse. So I kind of knocked on the door, and the little window open. Yeah, can we help you? And I showed him my badge. I go, door open. He goes, hey, come on in. We're getting ready for lunch. You want to eat? I said, hi, I'm Steve Green. But they didn't even wait for the introduction. He just said right away, we want to come on, we're getting ready for lunch. You want to come in and eat? Because he knew I was a firefighter. And that was it. And one of the things, again, fire, police, EMS, you can go almost anywhere in the world today, not just this country, in the world today, go to one of those stations and show them your ID, and you'll be welcomed in there. Even if you guys can't even speak to each other the same language, there will be that way of connecting with what we do and who we are. And I think that's one of the unexpected beauties of this work is that we do have not just the people we work with, but all over the country, all over the continents, all over the world, we can visit and say, hey, I do that too, or I did that too. And that's very special.
It is special. And, you know, that brings up another good topic that I'm seeing a ton in my practice and just kind of across the board. And I don't know if you have heard about it more or seen it in your neck of the woods, but is our leadership is changing a little bit, right? It's getting a little corporate-y and political versus, you know, the family orientation and the brotherhood and sisterhood and the backing. And so what I'm seeing is organizational betrayal is really crushing the people on the floor. The fact that they just all this stuff we talked about this family, the mentorship, you know, what you think you're getting into. And when, you know, leadership is starting to change and looking out for the interest of the city or their interest and not the interest of the members that are out there working, or, you know, like for some of our officers, they're not sure if, you know, they get in a shooting that the department's going to have their back. Same with fire, right? It's across the board I'm seeing. And so people are coming in more about how leadership is treating them versus the calls and the job or their marriage or these other things. They're coming in trying to like wrap their head around, how is the organization doing this to me? How could they possibly, you know, stab me in the back or throw me under the bus, do all these things to me? And so I am absolutely seeing a bigger increase in that lately, the last year or two for sure.
Right. And, you know, sadly, one of the signs that we see publicly is the fact when there are fights in the firehouse or at the station house or at EMS base. We would never, I mean, we would never fight with each other. We joke, we would have practical jokes. I mean, even the night that we were voted in, the first thing they did was, hey, we guys want to show you the pump and the impeller. And so we're going to take the cap off that outlet there, and then we're going to tell you to look down. I'm going to open it up so you can look and see the impeller. And of course, you know, 50 gallons of water came out, and here I am in a 3-piece suit, and I'm soaked. And I go, okay. And then I realized how funny it was, because this was even for this Jewish kid, this was my baptism into that fire service.
Yeah, it
was seeing that. So, you know, it didn't bother me. But today, you're right. We are seeing a lot of it. See it on social media. It started on social media about 3 or 4 years ago, where instead of just talking and expressing opinions, we started castigating people on social media. And then, of course, some of it came through that we found out these were all wannabes who were saying this. They weren't actually in any of the services, but they were just starting to stir up the pot. But people bought into it, unfortunately. And so we do see, even online, some of that. I want to be polite about this.
I know.
The difference of opinion in how people treat colleagues, even of the same rank, but also what you've mentioned about leadership. And it's funny because we're going to talk about your book in just a couple minutes in the news segment. But one of my guests who's been with a couple of times put out a book a couple of years ago called Fully Involved Leadership. Yeah. So I think when I saw your book title and I said, you know, Chief so-and-so would get a kick out of this, because I think those two topics could almost work parallel, because if we don't have leadership, then we don't have a cohesive agency. And if we don't have a fully involved life that we feel fulfilled in what we do with family, our job, our family, our vacation, our friends, then we have that black hole missing.
Same kind of concept, right?
Exactly.
Like, and I tell my couples that all the time. I talk about a mission statement, and we have a mission statement at work, and we know what our directives are. We know what the goal is. One of my favorite books is The Mission, the Men, and Me. And because if you keep that always in your perspective, the mission first, the men, others, or women, right? But mainly the troops, and then me, it'll always go appropriately. And I tell my first responders that applies at home too. Why don't you and your significant other sit down and write out a mission statement for your family so that you know what your objectives are and the focus and the drive and the goals are for your family, just like the same way you do at work.
Sure.
Right? There's roles and responsibilities for both, and you can apply those things that you love about the job to your home as well, but being on the same page and remembering the mission of our family comes first, not your ego.
Right. The mission statement for our families.
Yes. Yep.
That's what we need. That'll be a great place to take our break. And folks, we are going to take a break here. If you're watching the video, you're not going to see anything change. If you're listening to the audio, well, you know what happens. We're going to take a little break. We'll have a couple of PSAs on, and then we'll be right back with our guest, Dr. Mynda Ohs. And we're going to be talking about her latest book, Fully Involved Life, that we just kind of hinted at a little bit, the concept, but she will tell us all about her book right after we get back. As always, please stay tuned. Hello, and welcome back to this episode of Five Alarm Task Force. I'm your host, Steve Green, and with me today is Dr. Mynda Ohs, and we are talking about her time and experience when she was a first responder and how a incident with a patient got her sick as well, and after the repercussions of that illness were so great that she tried coming back, but really wasn't able to do it. And she found herself out of being a first responder, something that she loved and really wanted to do, suddenly, as I did when I blew out my knee again and I couldn't go back to being a firefighter. So we talked about how she initially saw and felt and dealt with that break in her life's chain of what she had planned. And now she's going to share with us about the first book that she wrote, Fully Involved Life. And then we're going to try to get a couple of minutes in where she can tell us about her new book also, When the Calls Stop, which, as you know, is a very important topic to me. And we're going to get a little bit from her. So I'm glad to welcome back our guest, Dr. Mynda Ohs. Welcome back to our second segment here. And please tell us, how did you finally make that transition to say, you know what, I'm going to write a book about what I went through?
Well, it's funny. My husband had been saying for years, you need to write a book. You need to write a book. And I was like, about what? My life is not that exciting to write a book about. And I had been starting to teach a lot more than just see clients. And I was doing a lot of spouse and significant other classes. And I never will forget the day that I remember I was a fire department was hosting me. It was two departments. And I had probably the biggest group of women, since I had started doing these classes. I had like 160. Wow. And I did my whole class. Yeah, it was really big for me. And I did my whole class and I talked about some of the things we've talked about, but I go in a little bit more depth about the unique challenges and I would tell stories, and it was just a good bonding, laughing, that we were all doing the same thing. And after the class, I remember looking up and there was this long line of women standing because they wanted to talk to me. And I was like, why are they standing there? Who do they want to talk to? And what do they want to talk to me about? But they all were like, thank you so much. We thought it was just us. Some of the stories you said were almost verbatim of the arguments my husband and I have had. And it was so refreshing and validating to hear you say this. And it was then that it dawned on me. And I went home and I told my husband, I'm going to write a book, because what I just realized as first responder families and first responders, we are all literally struggling with almost the identical issues. That almost even scripted to be the same. The arguments and the fights and the struggles are all the same. And we need to talk about it. We need to figure out, how do we deal with it? Because as I firmly believe, and I'm sure you do too, I don't see this career as a curse. I don't see it as this terrible bad thing. I think it's just that when you have the right mindset about what the challenges are and that they are unique, and you cannot approach them the way you would a regular marriage, right? If you're married to a banker or an IT person, that there's a different set of rules for us. However, someone forgot to give us the rule book. And so we're just kind of figuring it out. So that's how I look at it. My book is more of like the rule book and the what's normal. And I feel like once you read it and realize like, oh my gosh, this is everybody, it literally takes such a weight off of you that it's not my marriage only. We are all struggling with the same issues in a first responder family.
That's an important, and I'll tell you, it's so apropos. I told you I'm reading Chief Arjuna George's book, and so many things that he's talking about from his burnout after 20 years in the service, and how he talked about when he visited 9/11, the memorial. Well, actually, he got there a month after the attack, and what they asked him and a couple of the other firefighters who went with him to do is to attend funerals, because the rest of the firefighters were exhausted, and they need people who would recognize the honor and the valor of those who made the ultimate sacrifice. And like, as I'm reading every word, I'm seeing my name instead of his name as I read the pages. And I'm in like the third chapter, but it is, and it's not a thick book. It's one of the largest books, but I keep seeing myself in everything he's saying. And now listening to you, we're all hearing the same thing that he's saying, that you're saying, because every one of us, whether you're a year in or you're 30 years in, especially if you're a career firefighter, especially, if you're a career and you've got a year in under your belt or more, you already know the crap that we see. That's it. Okay. You want to get into fight fires. Well, sorry, 85% of our calls now are EMS. We're no longer a fire department. We're an all hazard department today, and most of us. With that being said, we have to realize that as much as we look to these professions as heroic in what we do, most of us, I would say the vast majority of us, don't see ourselves as heroes. We see ourselves like a banker, like an accountant, like a dentist, like the refuse collection guy, doing a job that we like to do. That's how we see it. But sometimes we don't know how to express that.
Yeah.
And so we get caught up in the bind of, should I continue to do this? Am I doing it right? Am I not doing it right? Who am I? Is this really me? And I think it boils down to, do you enjoy, not in the heart, but do you enjoy as a person what you're doing? I've met very few first responders who did not like what they were doing. They didn't like parts of it. Right. Nobody likes going on an emergency call that involves a child. Whether you're the rookie, the newbie in the firehouse, or you've got your 30 years in. None of us want to hear that call. And we all will say the same thing. And I think I read that Randy Mantooth from Emergency said something, that when you just hear the dispatch, you get that block in your throat when you try to swallow that child involved. We stop, our heart beats skips a beat, because we don't like the sound of that, but we know it's what we have to do. It's our job. So as you start putting that together and your ideas for the book, how did you find that balance between writing about what you went through, and I know you went back to school also. So what where did you find that balance between the person you had been, the person you were then currently being as you sat down to write, and the person who you are today?
Well, writing a book is quite a journey in
Yes.
itself. It was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. I thought, oh, you just sit down and write some pages. That's
Doesn't work
very
that
comfortable.
way. Nope.
No, it doesn't. So there was some growth in that. Even though I had written a dissertation for my PhD, it's still very different writing a book. So I started writing the book and I just started putting down ideas and figuring out. And I would give my husband my chapters and I'd be like, read this and tell me what you think. And we had some conversations that we had never had in our entire marriage. And, because he was like, you felt that way? And I would say, yeah, I did. And we'd have these great dialogues. And that's at that point is when I decided that I was going to add my husband's voice to the book. So initially it was just going to be my voice and I was going to talk clinically, about different stuff and add my own wife stories and experiences. And then when my husband had, started having this dialogue with me, I thought, you know what, this would be awesome for a lot of significant others to hear from somebody other than their first responder, how they see the situation or how they feel. Because sometimes I think as spouses, we're like, you're just making excuses or we minimize it, right? Till we hear it from somebody else and we're like, oh, that's a great idea. And we're like, what do you mean? I just told you that myself. So and I thought, wow, I think this will be really good because if we're dialoguing like this, maybe couples that read it together will dialogue like this. And then I went one step further and thought, listen, this just doesn't affect our first responder or our spouse or significant other. It affects our children. So my children wrote a chapter in the book. And so they talk about what it's like to grow up in a first responder family and what pressures they felt, because a lot of first responders will ask me, I'm screwing up my kids. I know I am, me not being there, or, I'm missing things. I'm screwing up my kids for sure. So I thought, well, let me have my kids write, a chapter in it. And then I put communication activities in the back of the book to help you as the reader figure out how to kind of improve your marriage. And so in that journey, one, I will tell you that my husband and I, it's funny, we resolved a lot of old stuff that we really hadn't resolved because it really boiled down to just misunderstanding and not communicating fully with each other. We had such great dialogue about it that I was pretty excited. When it came out, we had people texting us or messaging me on social media saying, this book is almost creepy, like you're in my house. Like you are spying on us and you have like these arguments are almost verbatim to the arguments we're having. And it literally gave me chills to know that hopefully my book and our experience was going to help new couples, even old couples, be validated knowing that it wasn't just you, it was the job and you just didn't know better. Nobody prepared you for it. And it's been pretty interesting to see the outpouring from it. And my poor husband, though, he was still working when the book came out and he was on an incident management team. He was an ops section chief for 10 years for CAL FIRE. And so when the book was huge coming out, when it just blew up, I was best top seller when it first came out for like the first year.
Congratulations. That's wonderful.
Yes, thank you. And so he would be at fire camp and he'd be sitting down and, some people would be, they're eating and talking and they'd come up and be like, are you Jeff Ohs? Are you the guy from the book? And he was like, yes, I am. It's me. He's like, I'm my wife's content, of course. But then people would sit down and be like, what book? And then someone would say, oh my gosh, you have to read the book. It's going to answer so many questions. And so it's been an amazing journey putting that book out.
You brought something up just a moment ago about firefighters who feel like, oh, I'm screwing up my kids and stuff like that. I don't know if you had the opportunity to watch Dick Wolf's finally decent show about the fire service, LA County Fire and Rescue.
Yeah, I did.
And I've always worn my emotions on my sleeve. Mm-hmm. So it was really meaningful for me to see firefighters real firefighters, not actors in a television show,
Mm-hmm.
with tears in their eyes as they talked
Mm-hmm.
about their job and what they had to do and what they had to see. And Paco, I think he's with 116,
Yeah.
who has trying to rebuild a relationship with his daughters.
Yeah.
And he also works in that where the firehouse is. In fact, he brings kids in to help them with school homework, and he encourages them to read, and will give them $1 for reading a book. And he helps, and they you have a problem with math, come and sit with me with math. Here's a man who realizes his mistakes and is working hard and has now realized there's no noose around his neck anymore. He's doing good things with his life now. He's taking care of the community beyond just being a firefighter. He's taking care of as someone who cares about his community. He grew up there. He knew what it's like to be in South LA, and to see him work this hard and to show emotions is amazing today. That it would have been laughed 25 years ago. It would have been laughed off of television.
100%. I mean, both you and I came from the suck it up generation. You know, even as growing up, being a Gen Xer, you know, we were never allowed to have emotions, and you were told suck it up, or, oh, you want me to give you something to cry about? So, you know, we came from a generation where you had to be tough, you had to hide it and push through. And, you know, there's so much research now that says that is so unhealthy, and that is, you know, can cause even medical issues when you know, when you don't express your emotions. And one of the things I see a lot for our first responders is they live in this perpetual state of guilt. Who am I going to let down today? Am I going to let down my department and my brothers and sisters? Or am I going to let my family down, my kids down? Who am I going to say no to today? And so it's this struggle that they're always battling. And then whoever they say no to then becomes this perpetual cycle of making it up to them, because they feel so guilty. And so, you know, that's literally where it starts, with the burnout and getting overwhelmed and, you know, sucking it up and compartmentalizing and pushing your feelings aside, because you're like, I just got to make it right by this person. Right. You know, and my husband, even after he retired, I told him my biggest fear was, I don't want to become your hobby. You know, like, I can't be your hobby. And he says all the time, I have making up to do. I have a lot of guilt of the things that I've done and the things you had to do and stuff like that. And I tell him all the time, I signed up for this as well. You know, you don't have to make up for it. Was just a stage in our life. And, you know, with kids, it's hard. I don't care what job you have. It's hard when you have children. Yeah,
it is. Amazing that you brought up the term suck it up, because it's a term that I hate totally, and because it was thrown at me. My buddy and I called about 1 o'clock in the morning, got called out for a pickup truck with fire overturned, and was right up the street from the firehouse. And he was down at the firehouse, and I only lived less than half a mile, so I was next one in, and the chief is screaming our chief never raises his voice really, but he's screaming on the radio, get me water, get me water, get me water now. And so we're standing around waiting for an officer to show up, and our driver, Bruce, says, forget it, we don't have time. We got to go. Steve, jump in the right seat. Let's go. And the chief, you know, I told my buddy Rich, I said, let's lay in. There's a hydrant right down when we come out on Friendly. We'll do that. And then it's like the chief heard me. He says, don't even go to the hydrant. Just get in here and give me the water. Give me the water. The victim's trapped inside. And they had dumped him, and another firefighter who lived right around the corner had dumped about 5 extinguishers trying to put this fire out. And what happened was, it was an old Chevy pickup truck that had the gas tank right behind the driver's door. And unfortunately, he was ETOH, and he swerved the car, turned over, skidded on the left side. The cap came off, the fuel leaked out, and the sparks ignited him. So Rich and I pulled in, and Rich pulled the line. He was on the nozzle. I backed him up. And when we first got there, the guy's still screaming. And I never had smelled burnt human flesh before. It just assault, because we didn't we didn't even put the time on to put our masks on. It was just such a short ride from the station to the call scene. And we did what we had to do. We got the fire out with the last drop of 500 gallons. EMS showed up because they had the hearse tool then, the supervisor. Our departments didn't have them yet individually. We got the guy out. He lived in the burn center for 3 days, then he passed. So we get back, we pack everything up, go back to the firehouse, clean everything up, and then I lost it. I just lost it. I went into the bunk room, the washroom, and started throwing up and puking and crying. And I just was sick. I was physically sick with it. And I didn't want anybody to see, so I washed my face and, slapped my cheeks a little bit and walked out. And Bruce is there. He looks at me and goes, "You okay?" And I said, "Yeah, I guess." He says, "This call?" And I said, "Yeah, man." He goes, "Suck it up."
Yep.
And Rich and I, there were only 2 or 3 calls that we talk about every time we're together, and that's one of them. Because we were on these 3 major calls together. All 3 of them were hardly traumatic. Another one was a drunk driver hit a small Volkswagen Beetle and killed a family of 4. And wanted to beat us because we tore apart his car to get him out. And there was one more. And so, we talk about, and we talk about why we still talk about it. It's because it still bothers us.
It's still playing.
It's still playing, and we share it with each other.
Yeah.
We share it, and that's how we...
what's harder. I didn't mean to interrupt. Sorry.
No,
Again,
okay.
I just wanted to remember it. But here's the other thing that I don't think a lot of people think of is that suck it up. You were told that. But as women in the industry, we have to suck it up even extra because we're women,
right.
And you're fragile. And if you cry, and that still exists today. I think that's why a lot of women in first responders tend to be a little bit more harsh and brash to prove that they can take it. I mean, I still remember clear as day, I was with my partner for over a year, so we were really close. And I remember my first hanging. And by the way, those are like my kryptonite calls. I hate hangings. I swear. I got them all. I don't know why, but it became the call that I always got. And my partner told me we got canceled on the call. And this is another thing that I push really hard is exposure. So we had been canceled by fire, but my partner was like, "No, you need to toughen up and you need to go in there and you need to see it because you've got to get tougher." And so he made me go in there and see this man hanging. And I swear to you, I will never forget. Again, I've been out of the field 26 years. I can still tell you what he was wearing. I can tell you what color the rope was. I can tell you what his house looked like. I can tell you all those things. And I remember running out of the house and getting back in the ambulance because he didn't get out. And I got back in the ambulance and I started crying. And he was like, "Don't you do it. Don't you dare cry, especially because you're a girl. They will think that you can't handle this job. So you better toughen up and get, thicker skin." And I just remember that point being like, okay, I can't show any emotions about these calls because they're going to think that I'm weak because I'm a girl.
The only thing I learned to do is to use the adrenaline to my advantage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But here we are 40 some years later, and Rich and I mean, he'll be down next month for 2 days. While we stopped studying, he's going to teach at another police department, and we'll go to lunch together like we always do, and we'll talk about these 3 calls.
Mm-hmm.
We'll talk about other stuff too, but
that's what happens. And honestly, that's what happens to the brain. So the way the brain works is you need a beginning, middle, and end, and for your brain to kind of process it. But with trauma, when it gets stored in the emotional side of your brain, it's hard for the logical side to get in there and say, "Listen, you did everything you could. It was a really awful call, but you didn't know them. It wasn't on your part or your failure to why they died." it literally can't get in there. And so we spin it, thinking about what we could have done different or how it could have ended different. And that's where burnout, compassion fatigue, PTSD come from, is how many calls do you have stacked in there that you're spinning like that, like those 3 calls, right? Can you imagine 30 years worth of careers and calls that people aren't talking about? And what they're not anticipating is when you retire, and this is why I wrote this, part of the reason why I wrote the second book is when you retire and you're out of that adrenaline, the work brain, and you're just in home brain, what's going to happen is your brain is like, oh, okay, cool. It's time to unpack 30 years of calls that you have not faced or dealt with. And so I get a lot of retired first responders. I've had a few that have been retired 8, 10 years. I just got one that's been retired 21 years from dreams and having reoccurrent memories of these calls that they ran, so many 20 years ago, and they're having nightmares now, or now vivid memories of, these calls running in their brain. And, these departments, they're teaching you about your 401ks and your deferred comps and PERS and make sure your numbers are good, but they're not preparing you mentally to being like, for my husband, he went from Chief O's to just Jeff in one day. And that's, it's not about arrogance. I really want that to be clear. It's not about like ego, or some people are like, oh, I don't take the job that seriously. It's not about that. It just doesn't matter. You're this one day, boom, and you're not the next.
Well, I will tell you that I'm old school.
Yeah.
And to me, I still call anybody who reached the level of a chief of kind.
Oh, yes.
I will always still call them chief. Call me Bill. No, you're chief. I was just a snot-nosed, belly-crawling nozzle jockey. That's all I was. I never got any brass, silver or brass, just my badge, and that's all I did. So you were a captain, you were a chief, you deserve that title, and even though you're a civilian, you earned it. You put those years in, and that's the way I am. And I just feel that, I still myself as this 25-year-old going into this fire department with all these other these officers who were older than me and more experienced and knew this stuff. And I had been everything in the Red Cross. I took every course you could in the Red Cross, had every badge Red Cross, became a water safety instructor as well, and taught rowing and canoeing and all that stuff. But it was a whole new book when I got in the fire service. But I wouldn't change my life even if I could, because it helped mold me. It helped give me something else to do. I never planned on doing that. I planned on being a rabbi. That's all I really wanted. Well, when I was really young, I wanted to be a helicopter pilot during the week and be the leader of the prayers on the weekends and the holidays. But as I got older, I wanted to be a rabbi and work with families, bring them to the synagogue and let them know that you don't just drop your kids off. There's a place for us, for life here. Didn't happen. Life took me down a different path, but I wouldn't change that path. If I had the opportunity to go to the left instead of the right, I wouldn't change it today.
Yeah.
Yes, I've made mistakes, other mistakes in life that I would like to get past. But my time in the fire service and working for EMS in North Carolina were 4 great years for me. And I'm just thrilled by it. But I also know that I'm still carrying burdens. Whether it's the emotional burdens and the mental burdens or the physical burdens of what happened. And that's something that we all have to be ready for if we're in the fire service. There could be a physical situation that arises that's going to knock you out of active service. And listen, I love doing what I did, and I would do it if I still was physically able to. I'd still do it today.
Yeah.
But it's just something that's so important that it's as you say, we define ourselves by it. And it's not just a job for us.
No, it's not. It's a calling.
It's a calling.
It's a calling. And I think the biggest thing, great segue of what you're talking about is, and it's my mission till I can't do it anymore, is changing the stigma of mental health and getting help. And that it's not about a sign of weakness. It's not about waiting till you're having a mental breakdown to get help. It's preventative. It's proactive. It's like not any different. I always tell people it's not any different than the doctor all of a sudden tells you you have diabetes. You're not going to ignore it or be ashamed of it or embarrassed. No, you're going to change your diet. You can check your blood sugar. You're going to take your medicine. Mental health is just not, quantifiable. You can't see it. It's not tangible. And so people have shame with it. But like you said, I wouldn't change a thing that I did. I loved it. It was the funnest gig I've ever done in my whole life. But I also feel like it has helped me be the clinician that I am now, because working with first responders, you don't have to tell me what it's like to see a dead body. You don't have to tell me what it's like to do CPR on a baby, because I've done those things. And I think that that's what makes me a good clinician. And that's where the trend is going across the board for most organizations and most states, is vetting the clinicians and getting what we call culturally competent clinicians. That it's like any culture, right? It's just like being Jewish. It's a culture. It has its own rules, its own norms, its own values within that culture. First responders are a culture, just like a religion or anything else, because we have our own set of rules and norms and values. And having a clinician come in that has zero clue, it's very difficult, because then you start telling them about the call you just told me about, right? The fire and the burning flesh. You're one of two things going to happen. One, the clinician's either going to be what I call a looky-loo, and now they want to have all the details. And research shows that getting somebody to tell all the gory details sometimes can be re-traumatizing. Or two, the clinician's going to start crying in the middle of session. And our first responders inherently are protectors. So now they're going to shut down and feel bad for the clinician. So finding the right clinicians, and I urge any department, now more departments have peer support programs, which is amazing. First line of defense, I truly believe. And those peer support programs and coordinators and members can call and interview clinicians to get the right clinicians that would be good fits, so that it doesn't burn a first responder that finally reaches out and then they just get a weird clinician and they're like, well, I'm not doing that again.
Right.
And so it's super important to have the right clinician, but getting help, don't wait till you're in crisis to get help.
Yeah, that's so important. And unfortunately, we're seeing, as you well know, we're seeing suicides going up in all three main branches of first responders.
Yeah.
We lost just a couple of weeks ago, we lost a firefighter outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, to his own hand.
LA City just had one.
Right, LA City just got one. We heard about that. And everyone that I read on social media or in the news blasts, it's like a little tiny knife in my heart.
Mm-hmm.
And I look, I know I'm crazy for doing it, but I'll say, maybe I could have done more on the podcast to talk about this. Maybe that person would have heard my guest and they maybe would have had second thoughts about taking their own life or something like that. And I know that I'm wrong doing that because I have no control over it. I don't know the person. They don't know me. I don't know if they listen, because stats don't tell us who listens to it, just where they are across the world when they listen. But that's who I am. I'm this very empathetic person that's always wants to help somebody who is hurt in one way or another, physically hurt or emotionally hurt. I've done dozens and dozens, officiated dozens and dozens of funerals, and I had an awakening, and I said, you know what? I feel that for me, it's very important that I meet with the family, not 10 minutes before the service. I meet with them the night before, and I'll spend 3 hours with them. And I said, listen, this is going to be a celebration of life. Don't tell me about the last 3 weeks when they were really sick. Tell me what jokes did he like to tell, and what drove you crazy. Tell me the good things and the funny things. And so I created, instead of just doing a eulogy, I made it a celebration of that person's life. And it's so fulfilling when you hear people laughing with tears, happy tears in their eyes, rather
Yeah.
than just crying from the tragedy of it. And it changed the whole landscape for me and the referrals that I started getting for it as well. And I've tried to do that through the podcast with the fire service and talking about these two major issues that we didn't have 25, 30 years ago or 40 years ago in my day. We didn't have firefighter cancer that we knew about. We didn't have mental illness in the fire service because we were all fine. And if we didn't, one of the guys would knock it into us to make sure we were fine. That's all changed. And the fact that you've shared these two books and your own path, and now your second book is very close to what you and I were talking about before we started, was this concept of not just the retiree, but the guy or gal that disables out after 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and they were looking for a whole career, and then something happens, they have to take a disability, and they can't. It really didn't change them who they were, but they're not allowed to fight fire anymore, or be in EMS, or be a police officer anymore, and that just cuts your legs off at the knees, emotionally.
It does.
And the fact that you're addressing this now, and I think what's really important, there were a couple of other books, a couple of authors I've had on this general issue. But the fact that, which I'm really glad to learn, is that Fully Involved Life came out first. And now the new one, hold on,
When the Call Stop.
When the Call Stop. Because this is so important to me, because this is my life. This is what I went through. And I think that, and I haven't read it, folks. I haven't seen it yet, haven't read it yet. But I can tell you that if it talks about this level of information for those of us who either retired after our full term or we had to disable out in less time than we wanted.
It does. I address I address 3 areas of retirement. I call it the lifers who make it all the way, the medical retirements, and then I also added the people that are retiring out for PTSD, because that's on the rise as well.
Very much so.
I talk about those, and then I incorporate that I did different in my first book, because the first book is mainly our journey and the things we struggled with. The second book, When the Call Stop, I did a survey monkey of 600 first responders, and then I interviewed various first responders and their significant others and asked about, like, what do you wish you knew? What went wrong? What went right? And so I add other voices into the book. Obviously, I talk about my early retirement. My son is a firefighter now. And
wow, that's cool.
Yeah, it is. And he talks about during his rookie year, he got thrown off the back of a fire truck and got injured and was out for almost a year and was told they didn't know if he was going to make it back. And he was 25, just starting his career. But thankfully, they did surgery. He's back and loving his life and doing good. But so I incorporate a lot of different scenarios to try to touch as many people as I possibly could, just to give you, a perspective that might hit home for you. And then there's a chapter, of course, my tax guy did, who works just with first responders, about which states have, income-free taxes and all those things like that. So I tried to hit it all. And it's a small book, so it's easy to read. I didn't make a big old novel out of it, just, a kind of like a guide.
That's great. And I think it's something that we need, especially today. The good numbers are going down and the bad numbers are going up. And the only way we should approach it is the same way we approach whatever we do in our 3 branches. We look at the situation, we assess it, and then we do the best to rectify the situation. And we need to do that same thing with our lives. It can't just be when we're responding on a call. If we don't do it on our lives, then we're not living our lives to fulfillment either. And we have to realize that there are other people we share our lives with. And so what hurts us can just as easily hurt them. And so we have to work together with our family members, our spouses, our significant others, and say, I think I've been an ass for the last couple of weeks, and I want to tell you why. I haven't been able to do it, but I think I can tell you now, and this is what happened.
Yeah.
And I think if that first step, that first step could be that first step to a pathway of clearing your head and feeling better.
Yeah. Or I tell people too, you don't have to share all of the details in your own head. Even if your spouse says, what's wrong? Clearly you look like something's wrong. And being able to say, you know what, I had a really bad shift, but I don't want to talk about it right now. Does such a world of good. Or the thing that, and I talk about this in my first book that my husband and I came up with, is I would say, what's wrong? Before he would say nothing. And obviously I could tell that something was up. He would just say either like, I'm exhausted, I'm just in a bad mood, but it's not you. And then it kind of like relieved me. And then I was like, okay, is there anything I can do to help? If he said no, all right, I just left him alone. I didn't like pick at it. Tell me what's wrong. But if our first responder is not communicating that, listen, I'm just not in the mindset to talk about it right now, then typically your significant other is going to probably hound you about it.
Right. That's a good point. And know that they're doing it out of care and love and compassion. Okay. And not to get into your head. They just want to make sure you're okay. And I think that's why we were with them. Right?
Yes, exactly.
That's what it's all about, is to share their life together. Mynda, I can't thank you enough. This was very eye-opening. And I'm so glad that you made the stepping stone. And it's nice to see a book or books about these issues that are coming from somebody who's been there, done that. Because when people talk from the outside and look in the window, I find most of the time they don't get it. They're not accurate. They have some stuff, some not. But when we write from the heart and from what our own personal experiences are or were, then we have a much better chance of sharing that communication with others, for them to say to the point, I guess I never looked at it that way. Maybe they have a point there. And if we can do that, then that's another good first step.
Yeah.
Just to make them realize it.
Absolutely.
Thank you so very much. I want to remind you, we're going to put, Dr. is going to send the links to me, and I'll put them in the show notes. But I want to remind you that her first book, Fully Involved Life, published in 2019. And the latest book, When the Calls Stop, was that published 2022 or this year?
21.
2021. When the Calls Stop. And that's one of the ones I really want to read, because that's part of my life. That's what happened with me. And I know I'm not the only one. I've spoken with some of you, connected with you on social media. So this is a book that, even though I haven't read it yet, I'm going to recommend you take a look at it, because for a lot of us, that break, that severance is very difficult emotionally. And we need to discuss that too. We don't have to hold it in. And this might be a way to learn something from it with this book. So if you're watching the video, folks, this will be the end of the video cast version. If you're listening to the audio, well, we're going to have a little break, a couple of public service announcements, and we'll be back with a couple of more items at the end. But Dr. Ohs, thank you so very much. What a great way to kick off our 8th season, to have an author, a member of the family of first responders, writing these 2 important books, taking from your own experience and helping to teach us how to guide our lives, whether you're a newbie or you're an old fart like me. We still have to do that. So as we conclude, I want to thank our guest, Dr. Mynda Ohs, for joining us. And as I said, we'll have more information on the show notes. And we want to thank you all for tuning in for this premiere episode of Season 8. And I'm going to ask Dr. Ohs not to leave when I stop the show, because I have a message for her for afterwards. But to all of you, thank you for tuning in. We really appreciate it. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. We have to get through the fire conventions that are coming up and the Jewish holidays. And then we'll be back right after that. But thank you for tuning in, everyone. We're always glad to have you. Remember, stay safe, stay well, and let's make sure to take care of each other. Thanks for tuning in, folks. Bye-bye.